Hi everyone, thank you for joining me again on GBN Originals. My guest today is a really good friend of mine, someone that I've got to know over the last few years, a commentator whose opinions they often chime with my own, but at the very least, I think for people like us who are interested and have inquiring minds, I think Ralph Schoellhammer's opinions and perspectives are very helpful. Whether you agree with everything he says, whether you agree with everything I say, neither here nor there. I think what you'll hear today in the context of this conversation will be broadening and expanding of horizons. Ralph Schoellhammer, thank you so much for making time.
Well, Neil, thank you so much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to a robust discussion.
Yeah, as I say, we've got to know each other over the last few years. We've had many conversations. And I think we are quite often of like mind, although not in everything. And I wouldn't even want it to be any other way. I want to be challenged and I want to have alternative points of view. But I think to get into it today, what's uppermost in my mind, what I would first of all like to open the door into our conversation with is to say, clearly the mood music across the European continent at the moment is about being prepared for war with Russia. And I wonder how that mood music makes you feel.
Well, it's a great question. So let's start from the very beginning. I recently started reading a biography of Karl Marx, and I bear viewers and listeners, please bear with us. Like this is, I hope, going into the right direction. And one of the things that I find so intriguing is the first time when Marx started to write about the working class was in 1843. And this was at a time when he never, set foot into a factory on a factory floor. He has never actually encountered the working class. So he was writing about something that he entirely made up in his imagination. And this is a little bit how it feels to me, what you see among particularly the Brussels elite. As you just said, right, they talk about war, preparation for war. Manfred Weber, the head of the European People's Party, said that Europe needs to start to go on a war economy footing and all these kind of things. And they talk a little bit about this as Marx did about the working class. So it's a little bit play acting, if you want, right? You want to sound butch. You want to talk about this, but I'm not sure if they're entirely aware what this would actually mean. I mean, you know this and your viewers know this, that there is this weird idea that once you put this into action, into whatever extent, that it's not going to have any real consequences. I mean, look at Keir Starmer and some others, Emmanuel Macron. We're going to put troops in Ukraine, whether the Russians want it or not. I mean, this is the point in a conflict is, and I think you alluded to this, that the opposing side has a say in this. And this is a little bit what I mean when I say it's a little bit like play acting. So I think they don't take seriously the kind of consequences that would have. And that does remind me a little bit of this 19th century, philosophical elite that had all these very often very interesting, these great thoughts, but they actually were not really connected to the daily lives of the people. And what you see in the UK, and that's true all over Europe, but I think it's particularly interesting in the United Kingdom, because one thing that I always treasured about the British compared to us German speakers is we were always a little bit, the romantics, the Hegelians, the Marxists, but the British were always solidly grounded in the real world, in real life. And I think what you see now happening also in Britain, which is almost, I would say, a very German phenomenon, is that they also, particularly the political class, they cannot get things in order at home, so they have ever more flights of fancy abroad. Ukraine, net zero. Look at somebody like Ed Miliband. And all kind of world peace and global politics, geopolitics, but you cannot have cheaper eggs, or as we would say at the time in Europe, you cannot make the trains run on time. And this is where I think also people like you and I sometimes have to be careful. If you would ask the average German or Austrian, but I also think the same is true for the average British people, what they really want is things to work again, a feeling that things are working again. You go out your front door and you go down your street and it's a clean street. There's not graffiti. There are no broken windows. The subway is on time. The subway is clean. It's these kind of things. Politics has become so absurd that they have all these high and mighty goals, but the very basic issues that matter for most people in their daily lives, it feels that they either entirely ignore or pretend they are incapable of doing anything about it. And I feel that this is what very often frustrates people more than anything else.
Do you subscribe at all, Ralph, to the notion that's out there that Europe, European civilization, archaic notions, even like Christendom, are being deliberately dismantled, are being taken apart. And if any of that is true in the case, I happen to think it is, where do you think that antipathy towards what has been European civilization has come from?
So I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on this. I think one of the and this is something I thought I'm just recently have started to develop. So again, bear with me. So this is all still very raw in many ways. But I think one of the key pillars of Western civilization was this idea that every right has a corresponding obligation, right? Has a corresponding duty. So you were the very idea of citizen, I think, was this, that you had certain rights, you had a say in politics, you could participate, you had freedom of speech, but there was also the expectation that, and we talked about this previously on your show once, right? When we talked about the realm of manners, so to speak, there was this idea that you were expected to carry yourself in a certain way, right? That you, as Enoch Powell once said, I know he's a disputed figure, but many things he said I think were right, is that, you adhere to good form. And what we have become in the West to such a large extent on one end is we are super focused on the matter of rights, right? Individuals have the right to this. You are entitled to that, from healthcare to schooling to, and a basic income, all these kind of things. But there's never any idea of the corresponding obligations. And the problem with that, I believe, is that as human beings, sometimes the things we don't want to do are the things that make us actually feel best about ourselves. So being a responsible citizen, again, might be more exhausting than just being somebody who just receives entitlements. But when you go to bed at night, you probably feel significantly better about yourself. And I think this is what politics to a large extent has forgotten. They no longer dare, even though I believe that people would understand it and appreciate it, they no longer dare to kind of put obligations both on the citizens, but also on newcomers. This is why I believe that integration is failing, because it's all about you give to people that come to your country, but you don't really ask anything in response. And then because they fail on this level, they then try to distract, if you will, with other issues like what you mentioned before. I mean, the war in Ukraine, for the Ukrainians, it's about Ukraine, which I completely understand. But for the leading class in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, right, this is about saying, we cannot really take care about the things that matter for you because we have this huge issue we have to take care about first. It becomes an excuse. I mean, look at Germany, for example. Germany was a country that for nigh on 2 decades was saying, we cannot spend money on infrastructure. We cannot spend money on building housing. We cannot spend money on education. And now all of a sudden, when it comes to these war preparations and how effective they're going to be, we can talk about in a second. They say, we can take out debt in the amount of 1 trillion euros, which is a number you know from the United States, but you haven't heard them in Germany. And of course, people are now asking, wait a moment, when it is about us, there is no money. When it's about somebody else, there is money, no object. And this is what frustrates people. And you do create, I was looking this up, and I'm sure that many of you who remember this, one of the best conversations or most viewed conversations that you and I had was when we talked about the creation of pre-revolutionary conditions all over Europe. And I believe when we had this conversation 18 months ago, that we have been proven right. I think we are still on track in Europe for these pre-revolutionary conditions. It's just that people have become somewhat complacent, and something we can also talk in greater detail, because that's the insidiousness in many ways of the modern political system. It's not forcefully suppressive, but it drains your energy. And you can see this, and I'm sure you know this also with your viewers and listeners. It's that people are angry, but they also feel drained. They feel enervated, right? They say, what's the point? There's nothing you can do anyways. Where can we go? How can we voice our opinion? And this is, I think, this combination. It does, however, last point on this, and this is what you particularly see in the United Kingdom with Keir Starmer, which is a great surprise. It gradually now is morphing into a more suppressive system. This is something I also want to talk about with you in greater detail, because what we see, which is so fascinating, all over the West, the United States might be slightly different, is a complete erosion of the legitimacy of governments. And what happens if a government feels they're no longer legitimate? They start to panic. If you feel that the people no longer voluntarily invest you with power or accept your power, you start to become more repressive because you feel you have to hang on to it, and everybody who challenges your power, either in speech or on social media, or otherwise is somebody that you have to either silence or, in the worst case, that you have to suppress. Just as a quick side note, because I already see the comments about this conversation, I think this is, for example, true about Tommy Robinson. I have I'm an unassimilated foreigner, so I have my issues with Tommy Robinson. But the way he's treated does, I'm curious to hear your point on this, makes him, in my view, a political prisoner. Right? Because you can disagree with him, you can say he shouldn't say the things he says, you can agree with him, but the way he's treated, the kind of the heavy-handedness of the government regarding him, I mean, these are all the elements of tyranny. But why do they do it? Because they want to make an example. They say, we treat him in a way, it's as Mao said, punish one and educate 1,000. And I think this is precisely what we are seeing.
I think he is. I think it's absolutely legitimate to regard Tommy Robinson as a political prisoner, without a doubt. There are obviously there are different ways in which you could interpret what is happening, and there are different excuses that you could and that have been being made for the way in which Tommy Robinson is being held. But it's absolutely overwhelming. I think the legitimacy for suggesting that he is being held as a political prisoner. And I don't know, I genuinely don't know who that serves. I don't know who benefits from Tommy Robinson being held as a political prisoner. But you mentioned, go on.
I think first of all, you send a signal, but there's something else. This is, I don't know precisely how to describe it. I think if you look at all these the most vicious totalitarian systems in history, I think very often, and we have pretty good evidence for this, because we have the diaries, we have the documents and everything, that usually at the beginning when they started, and very often they're evil, they had concerns about it. But once they realized that, you know what, we have done all this, we have, like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, we have deported people, we have killed people, and actually, at the beginning, you felt uncomfortable. We had Heinrich Himmler's speech in Posen, for example, in 1943, where he says, look, we kind of felt bad about this at the beginning, but the more we do it, the less bad we feel about it. And I think this is why the whole Tommy Robinson thing worries me so much, is because you start doing this to one person, and then you say, you know what, as the government, you say, no, actually, we don't even feel bad about this, so we can do it to more people. This is, by the way, not just my argument. This is the argument that Mark Stein is making.
Absolutely.
You become completely numb to the kind of moral violations that you're conducting, and then you do end up in a slight form of tyranny, if you will.
I mean, it's it's been said by others, but it's worth saying again. It's worth any of us saying that it's when if Tommy Robinson is someone with whom you disagree on for whatever reason, it's when you see Tommy Robinson as a metaphor or as a symbol being treated in this way, because you don't like him and don't agree with him, that you have to stand up and protest at what is being done to him. It's a classic case of that. It's too late to wait until someone that you do like is being treated that way to protest. I mean, this is it's almost cliched to lay this out, but it never gets old. You have to stand up. You have to stand up and protest the questionable, if not ill treatment of people you disagree with. Exactly. Otherwise, any subsequent attempt you make to protest about people you do genuinely care for sounds hollow. You have to. One has to do it for one's enemy before one does it for one's friend, 100%. Or it sounds insincere.
No, that's the point. Right? If you say you have principles, the real test for your principles is whether or not you apply them to people you disagree with.
You're
absolutely right. It's always easy. It's I say, I give freedom of speech and freedom of opinion, a freedom of conscience to everybody I agree with. That is easy. Can you do it to somebody you disagree with? And you see, if we take a quick journey across Europe, you see, it's all these small things the media isn't even reporting. I'll give you one example. Like the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, became the second strongest party in Germany. And usually it has always been, there is no legal requirement, but it has been an agreement among the German parliamentary parties that the president of parliament, the strongest party has one president, and then the second strongest party has the deputy president. The second strongest party would be the AfD, and now they managed to deny them this second presidency. I mean, they say, listen, we're not obliged to do it from a legal perspective. No, but it's something that, as you just described, it was done out of principle. It was done out of principle for almost 80 years. And now you break this rule. And I think then it's just tiny steps to something else. Or if you look what they try to do with Le Pen in France, right? They say, well, she was apparently embezzling some EU funds. I mean, that is not okay. But everybody knows when they say, she should be banned from running for president. This is not because they worry so much about embezzlement of money in the European Union, because if we take a close look at the European Parliament, the kind of money that is embezzled there on a daily basis, nobody there could stand for election at any time in the future. Or what happened in Romania is another example. Now, I think that Georgescu is a problematic figure for a variety of reasons. But then again, they didn't care about him when they thought he cannot win the elections. When it became clear that he can win the elections, all of a sudden they had to ban him from running. Because this is an argument when people say, but Ralph, he's a weird figure, like, shouldn't he be banned? The argument is always the same. If there were reasons for him to be banned, that reasons already existed in December of 2024 when the first round of the elections took place. So if you have no objection to the guy running, unless he wins, as you said, then you're not really living up to your principles. You say, oh, we can let him run, he's not going to win anyway. Then it comes up that he's actually potentially winning, and all of a sudden they say, we have to ban him from running. And this is, of course, also what partially happened with Donald Trump in the United States. It's exactly right what you say. It's all these principles that a democracy, I would even go a step further, a civilized society runs on. All these principles are being eroded. But what is left if you have a society that can no longer rely on people doing quote unquote the right thing? The alternative can only be first a soft form of authoritarianism, but then a harder one. And this is what I fear so much. You and I not, and your viewers, by the way, also not. So we are almost in our own little bubble here. But we understand that so much of our daily lives depends on people behaving the right way because they first take pleasure in it, they take pride in it, they know it's the right thing to do. But if you see people all around you constantly breaking those principles and those rules, at some point you're going to ask yourself, okay, why am I the only one who constantly tries to play by the rules when everybody else is breaking them? And the worst thing I think we experience at the moment is the people we would expect the most, at least to pretend to play by the rules, are increasingly the ones that do it the least. And I think this is really, really, when I say we are in pre-revolutionary conditions, that is what I mean, because at some point the people will say, if we can no longer rely on these basic principles that make democracy and civil society work, maybe democracy and civil society as it exists at the moment has to go as it is. And I think then you really create the conditions for a strong man or a potential, fascist movement or whatever it is to come. And that does worry me, because you can sense, and I'm sure, Neil, you know this as well. If you fall, this is at the moment at the fringes, but if you follow a little bit both on the right and on the left, if you follow the debates on social media and kind of the thought leaders, if you want, that and the way that they express themselves, this is somewhat reminiscent in a very small level. Like, not everything is Nazi, not everything is Bolsheviks, but you can sense more and more this idea that, you know what, maybe it is the entire system that has to go. So maybe it's not about the competition within the parliamentary democratic system. It is about the system itself that is to be questioned. And that is, of course, the very thing that people said in the 20s and 30s as well.
You mentioned earlier obligations. I wonder, to whom do you think the von der Leyen, Macrons, Scholz, Lagarde, Starmer, to whom do you think they feel obligated? Because it's plainly not the people.
I think that is very true. And I would argue that the sense of obligation they feel, and I don't want to drift too much into cliche, but I think it is still true, is with what Samuel Huntington, almost now 30 years ago, called, Davos man. This is, I know it's a trope, and every one of your viewers has heard it a million times. But when Keir Starmer was asked what's more important to him, or along these lines, Davos or Westminster, he did say Davos. And I think that is not this. The fun part about all of this is people say, "Oh, Ralph, Neil, you are venturing over into conspiracy territory." Well, if they openly say it, it's not really a conspiracy anymore, is it? And you see the same, I think, with somebody like Ursula von der Leyen. It's as you correctly point out, there is no longer this sense of obligation towards your own people. I think it's almost, and this is what everybody can feel. And as I said before, this is one of these major things that underpins so many of the troubles we find ourselves in. There's a very strong sense for most of the people, and I think that sense is justified, that the elites despise them. Right? That the purpose of democracy is no longer to express the will of the people. Increasingly, the purpose of democracy appears to be to prevent the people from participating. Right? This is what you see when we talk, for example, about this whole protecting democracy. In a way, democracy is working just fine. The British last general election was a little bit different, but if you look at elections in the United States, in Germany, in France, more people go to the polls. There are many new parties. There are many new individuals with I don't agree with all of it, with interesting political programs. So this is exactly what you would like to see in a democracy, right? This competition of ideas, these new people, and people going to the polls, people voting. But it's a little bit absurd if you have more and more people going to the polls, but their vote appears to have less and less of an impact. Of course, people realize this. And exactly as you said, they no longer feel obligated to say, you know what, obviously the people are frustrated. We have to address the mistakes or the things we have done in the past and try to do them differently. What they say is, we are not the problem. The people are the problem. And I think this is exactly what you see both in the political discourse, but also in the kind of policies that are being pursued. I mean, again, every one of your viewers knows this, but whether it's the Digital Services Act or all this, the idea that the government should control social media, this comes all from the fear of government and the sense that they're being less and less and less legitimate. And just as a quick add-on to this, I'm sure, do you know, Neil, do you know David Betts?
No.
He is, I only came across him recently. He's a professor of strategy at King's College in London. And he did a couple of interesting podcasts recently. And his theory is that the United Kingdom, but also Europe, that it is in the early stages of the onset of a civil war. And he makes this, I think, very convincing case that he says one of the reasons why this might happen is because those who are in charge, both the elites, but also those in government, are becoming less and less and less and less legitimate. And what makes Professor Betts so interesting is that he makes this from a purely academic viewpoint. So he's not, you and I, we are commentators, but he makes it like on a very solid basis. He looks at countries where civil war broke out and says, if you look at the conditions in these countries, and then you compare the conditions to what's going on, particularly in the cities, in the UK, in Austria, in Germany, in France, you find many of these similar conditions. The only reason we don't talk about this as much is because we simply believe it cannot happen here. But he says if you just follow the data, the likelihood of it happening here is actually much higher than people tend to believe.
It's very interesting. I will look at what Betts is saying based on the way that you've preceded his thesis there. But I would say there's a fundamental difference between then and now that I feel viscerally. That the people that have been almost left behind as leaders, as though a tide of seriousness and credibility and legitimacy had withdrawn, like a tide. These people that have been left behind for good or ill in those positions, I don't think people take seriously. You know, when at times of revolution, in France, in Russia, in America, on either side of the divide, I think were personalities that one could take seriously, disagree with powerfully, but would take as credible. I think part of the problem for the people, I'm mixing with regular people every day, working people with regular lives, and they just don't take people like Starmer, people like Macron, people like the commissioners of the European Union. They don't take them seriously to the point where they're a joke. And I think there's a difference in the kind of revolution that might unfold when the people think, goodness me, we have to do something here, not just because something needs to be done, but because the people, one way or another in positions of power, are ridiculous.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And you alluded to this, I think, quite eloquently, which is precisely you only can have substantial disagreements if there is substance. And this is the problem you see with many of our current political leadership. it's hard to disagree with them precisely what you said, because there's such lack of substance. What do they stand for? I find this always, and I don't want to overdo the whole 1920s, 1930s comparison, but if you put a fascist vis-a-vis a communist, at least they had a substance on which they disagreed, right? These ideologies were designed to provoke an argument. But nowadays, like they don't even provoke an argument. It is as the famous saying goes. It's like playing tennis with the net down. It's very difficult to have a serious, substantial conversation about what this was the famous Angela Merkel thing, right? It's without an alternative. So there's not even a point talking about it, because there isn't anything that can be done about it. And first of all, things become boring. But as you correctly point out, at some point, you probably almost, as an individual, as a citizen, have a longing for someone, even with whom you disagree, as long as they provide some substance. And this is what I find so remarkable. If you look at polls in the United States, right, not everything is currently going well in the United States for a variety of reasons. But the reason I would argue, why Trump is still riding fairly high for him, right, given his past in the polls, is because nobody can deny that they are currently trying to do things. Now, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording this show. Like, I don't agree with everything they do. I have my own disappointments, and we can talk about these in greater detail. But I think nobody can deny that they are trying to do things exactly as you say. And you say, okay, you know what? I disagree with lots of things, but they are serious about doing things differently. They are serious about saying how we have done things in the past is no longer working. Let's try something else. And I do. I find that appealing. And I think this is what so many people long for in Germany, in Austria, in the United Kingdom, in Spain, in France, you name it, all over the West, I would argue.
I'm very interested as well, while I have you, because I want to give some space to this point. The Russophobia that is supposedly the basis for, saber rattling about going to war. I'm fascinated to get your take on where that's coming from. I look back on Russian history, and to me, the Bolshevik Revolution was, the Bolsheviks hated the Russians. The Bolsheviks, goodness me, killed tens of millions of Russians out of hatred as much as anything else. So to look back on Bolshevik or Soviet Russia in this context, I think, is erroneous. Because it wasn't representative of the Russian people. And when you come more recently and you contemplate 1989, the wall coming down, and there was that palpable sense coming from the other side of the divide of Russians, not the regime necessarily, but Russians hoping that now might be the time in which they would be welcomed back into the European family, instead of which they got a big hand held up in their face and told, no, you can't come in here. Whence comes this Russophobia? Why am I, as a British person, being told to hate Russia to the point where I would contemplate my teenage boys being conscripted into a war to fight them? Why is Ursula von der Leyen and the rest of them, Starmer, talking about planes in the air and boots on the ground in Ukraine to fight Russia? What is this not the regime, this anti-Russian feeling? Why am I supposed to feel that?
Well,
because I don't.
This is going to be better. So I'll try to answer your question in two ways. And the first one is, and again, I have to implore your viewers and listeners to bear with me for this argument, because this is the most difficult argument. And so I'm glad you asked the question. I've been wrestling with myself nigh on 2 decades now. And it's this dilemma you have. If on the one, I love my country, right? I love its history. And when I say my country, I mean Austria particularly, but let's say German culture in general. But of course, there are, more than for the British, there are many very dark spots in our history. So, and I think that the same applies to the Russians. So on the one hand, you have a certain nostalgia about the time when your country was, powerful, strong. And you identify with it and its history in the dark places and let's say the more uplifting ones. And I think the same dilemma is what the Russians. This is why I think the Germans and the Russians, despite all the wars and everything they had, tended to get along fairly well historically because they shared this sense of pride and misery sometimes at the same time, if you want. And that's the difficult thing. So if you would ask, and I can only speak from the few Russians that I know, so you will hear simultaneously exactly what you just said, right? That they say, listen, the Bolsheviks, Stalin, they killed millions of Russians. So kind of to basically say Bolshevism equals Russianism is wrong. But then at the same time, you can also sense, of course, that they did take or do take a certain pride in the rise of Russia / the Soviet Union to a superpower after the Second World War. And this it sounds schizophrenic, but it is a little bit it's a little bit like if you have a relative, like my mother, or let's say you have I don't know if you have any siblings, Neil, but if you have a brother who's who does something stupid, you can say, God, my brother is such an idiot. But if I would say, you know what, Neil, your brother is an idiot, you probably would immediately jump to his defense. And this is, I think, also what we see in the case of Russians and Germans and pretty much everybody with their own country. You are aware of the dark sides and the dark spots, but they are still your dark spots, right? They are still kind of your demons you have to wrestle with. And I think this is a little bit what you also see in the Russian case. Now, the second point that you made about kind of this Russophobia, my sincere belief is that the left, or those who we would colloquially call the left, that they always envied the right a little bit. The right had these, despite everything that happened since the 60s and wokeness, all the things that we talk about all the time, they still had a sense of the pleasure of community, if you want, whether it was going to the pub, whether it was going to a football game, like being in a crowd, kind of on occasion lose yourself and be part of something that is bigger than yourself. And it appears to me that with Russia and the war in Ukraine, they finally found a war. They finally found a nation they can be nationalist about. I mean, I said this, I think, on your show and in the past. I find it so almost absurd, or a case of cognitive dissonance, that the same people that tell us that, Ukraine must remain ethnically Ukrainian and the borders of Ukraine must be respected. The same people that say, I say it now in a little bit of a provocative way, I hope you can forgive me, that say that Kiev has to remain Ukrainian. If somebody says, yeah, I agree, and I think London should remain British, would say, oh, you're a racist and a quasi-fascist, even though it's the same argument. And I think this is the thing. People like Starmer, like von der Leyen, they finally found the nationalism. They finally found the flag, right? They can nail to their mast, or as we would say nowadays, they can put into their social media profile. And this is why, by the way, this doesn't make it less problematic. But this is why I take all this talk about war. It's play acting, because in order to really do this, the kind of sacrifices they would have to demand, the kind of policies they would have to enact, I believe they're incapable of doing it. But to be very clear, I think in trying so, they will still do a lot of damage. So I'm not sanguine about it, but I think for them, it's playing a game. I give you an example, my favorite one. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and Luxembourg is basically the size of your rec room at home. He recently said that Luxembourg stands side by side with Ukraine. What's that supposed to mean? Right? It sounds good, and people nod, and you get lots of likes on social media. But what exactly is Luxembourg going to do? Will Luxembourg send the first Luxembourgian airborne to Moscow? Right? There's no, as you said before, there is no substance to it, and it's even worse because if you talk a big game, but you cannot back it up. I mean, as you said before, you make yourself look quite ridiculous, and I think this is exactly what we see happening all over Europe.
I do wonder at the extent to which the people doing this, the people whose names we have already checked, how they think they can pivot in the way that they have in this warmongering, nationalist, patriotic way without 2 or 3 generations of their people seeing straight through it, as though through the filmiest gossamer gauze. Because our generation, the younger generation, an older generation, certainly in somewhere like Germany, Austria, people have been brainwashed, or the attempt has been there to brainwash them into being ashamed of their past, of their culture, of the patriotism of the past. Look at patriotism and see where it got us. Look at nationalism and see where it led us. And then within that lifetime, they now try to pivot as though the youngest generation would contemplate standing up to defend something that their generation, their parents' generation, and their grandparents' and great-grandparents' generation have been taught to be ashamed of.
Yeah.
Why do our supposed leaders think that none of us have a memory, individually, culturally, and collectively? Because we do. We remember what we've been being told for the last 70 years. And now there's this attempt at a kind of ersatz Kitchener poster, your country needs you, push for war with Russia. Why on earth would these ridiculous people think they could make that flag fly?
Well, I think it was Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and he wrote this, I believe, already in the 70s. It was either an essay or a book, so I'm not entirely sure, that was called The Disuniting of the United States of America. And he was making precisely that argument. So this has been going on for a long time, but as so often with ideas, right, they are formulated as Aya Berlin would say, in the still of a study of an intellectual, and then they gradually, through the university and everything, they start to trickle down. So we had the big advantage until the 70s or 80s, we could live off the cultural capital that was accumulated by previous generations. But I think this cultural capital, this social capital, is now being depleted. And the thing, you're absolutely right, because let's be very clear about this. Because one could say, oh, Neil or Ralph, you have these high and mighty philosophical conversations, but does it really matter? But it does matter, because if you no longer care about something, then the things start to fall apart. And this is what you see happening in the West. Right? If you no longer care about your community, about your society, about your civilization, about your traditions, then it starts to disintegrate, then it starts to fall apart. Then all of a sudden, you don't care if the trash has been taken away. You don't care if if there's graffiti on the wall. You don't care if the infrastructure works, because, as they would say, what's the point anyways? And this is, I think, increasingly what we are moving towards. So the kind of conversations we're having right now, this is not, it is partially, of course, philosophical, but this has real life consequences. Take, for example, the civil service. There's a massive difference if your average civil servant all over the place is doing their job or are doing their job because they take pride in it, right? They represent almost, if you want to stick a little bit to Marxist terms, a class consciousness, right? That they are the pillars on which British, German, Austrian civilization rests. That is going to be a completely different attitude if you say it is just a job for a country I think I don't really believe in, but at least I get a monthly paycheck. And I think this is exactly what we see happening, that if you don't have this kind of emotional attachment to what you're supposed to uphold, to work for, then it will start to disintegrate. It's like the fun part is we all know this. If you do not love what you do, if you do not have any kind of passion for the people you feel you work for, then things will not work well. And I think this is exactly what we are seeing. So there was this idea once, I don't know if it was in Britain or in Germany and the United States, that I would also not want to have a test or something, because then it's already too late. But this idea that patriotism should be a precondition for somebody joining the civil service, I mean, that should actually go without saying, but it doesn't. And I think this is where you see the problem already forming.
You mentioned you've already invoked revolution or rebellion. I can't remember which R word you used, but in any event, and I've listened to people like Colonel Douglas MacGregor talking about, he was floating the idea of the necessity in Britain of a Cromwellian figure, in that way to sort of cast out the dead wood that's there in Westminster, that's there in Parliament. That idea is alive out there. And I do wonder, when you talk about revolution, I wonder, because it does seem to me that there is the dry tinder, the necessary kindling of a conflagration lying dormant. And it seems to me that because our so-called leaders are, as we've previously discussed, so ridiculous, so inept, so that people don't take them seriously, that we are in a dangerous situation potentially, because if that dry tinder catches, there is those that would be opposed to it are in no position to fight it.
I think that's true, and you're absolutely right, and I agree with Colin McGregor. Absolutely, I think this is exactly these kind of pre-revolutionary conditions that we have been talking about. I mean, the big irony, and this I find both encouraging and worrisome, is that the demands of the people, if you will, are not that outlandish. So this is not the kind of 1848 or 1917 or whatever you want to call it, revolution for an overthrow of the existing order and the reestablishment or the establishment of some utopian ideal. I think most people would simply want to go back to a time where they think that the world around them was working, that the world around them was familiar to them. I mean, this is, I find always I don't try to dodge the question or shift the topic, but I think this is always the biggest issue about the migration debate. It's not so much about necessarily the migrants themselves, but it is a sense that the world around you becomes less and less and less familiar. And we talked about this. I mean, I sincerely believe that people have a human right to a home, to a place they call home. And what is home? It's a place that feels familiar to you. It's a place where where your soul comes to rest. And I don't want to get all romantic and, again, as we did early on. But if people lose that, they get angry because then you're uprooted. You're no longer at home in your home. And this is if you go out on the streets, there's so many people everywhere say, when you say, what bothers you? And they say, I do not recognize my country anymore. So the simple thing, the small, tiny thing that they demand is they still want to recognize their country. Now, I know immediately then the counter argument is, but Ralph, that sounds reactionary. Don't you think that societies shall change? Yes. But the pace of change must be an evolution. In the same way, you and I, Neil, we are men in our middle ages, so to speak. But you are still distinctively Neil Oliver. I'm still distinctively Ralph Schoellhammer, even though I'm, of course, not the same person I was 20 years ago, because my views have evolved. I've become, more mature, if you want. But people around me, they still know me, right? This has not changed. And the same is true with society. Of course, you want things to gradually change, to become different, to become more modern, whatever you want to call it. But it's supposed to be an evolution, just like you watch your child grow up. You want to see, your child is different at the age of 10 than it is at the age of 20, than it is at the age of 30. But it is still your child. And this is, I think, how people feel about society as well. But what we are experiencing all over the place is not an evolution of society. It is a transformation. And I believe, and I'm happy to have disagreements on this, that most people say, we were never asked if we want that transformation. And this is why they are frustrated. And they're absolutely justified in their frustration.
Do you think that, I like to think that the roots of the European Christendom, whatever you want to call it, but the 1,000 years and more, the 1,500 years and more that is the foundation for, everything that's happened, Renaissance, the Age of Reason, Industrial Revolution, and so on and so on. I think those roots are very, very deep. Like the roots on a wisdom tooth. Very, very hard to remove. Or you could use the analogy of a yew tree. that can be cut down at the roots, can be cut down at ground level, but it's as perennial. It just comes back. And I wonder if, although for us limited terminal, 70, it's very difficult to look at what's happening just now because it feels like change forever, irrevocable change. But I wonder if you think that the roots that gave birth to everything that European civilization have been are in fact so deep that much of the decay that's happening at the moment will fall away, and that there's still enough there of the taproot or whatever that means that the European mindset, the European mind, the European way, European civilization will prevail in the face of this surface chaos.
Well, there is a countryman of yours, Tom Holland, right, who wrote this great book, Dominion, about how basically Christianity made Western civilization. And in this book, he tells this great story about, I think his name was Alcuin. He was an advisor. I think he was
Alcuin of York.
Irish. Yes, exactly. So he was an advisor to Charlemagne, right, to Charles the Great, and they were talking about, apparently they took regular baths with each other, which I find is just an interesting historical tidbit. And they were talking about how can they convert the Saxons to Christianity, and apparently Charles said, "Oh well, this is easy. We just go there, and we put them to the sword, and either they convert to Christianity or we kill them." And apparently Alcuin said, "You know what? That's an interesting proposal, but usually if you do that, it doesn't stick." Because then people only become Christians because you force them to, but they don't really believe it. And the beautiful story, and there are dark sides to every historical development, but the beautiful story about Christianity is that it did not simply dismantle institutions; it filled them with new life. Whether this was again, and then I know some people would say, like Edward Gibbon, ultimately, or even Nietzsche, they would say it ruined the Roman Empire. And whatever one position one takes. But the idea is that Christianity is still around because it took this, as we just talked a couple of minutes ago, this evolutionary approach that you take existing institutions and then you fill them with new life. I'm not sure, and I hope I'm wrong on this. I'm not sure if we can still do this because I agree with everything you said, but there is this. It almost seems. You have all these interesting figures like Ian Hirsi and Jordan Peterson and Neil Ferguson and people I admire, people whose work I read and I find very intriguing thinkers. But there is now this idea that they want to be what I call, for lack of a better term, functional Christians. Right? They say, as you just said, we know the value of our civilization, so we adopt it on a rational basis. But I don't think that works because the emotional content is crucial for it. I mean, imagine. I know you have a wonderful wife, Neil. You would never tell your wife, you would never say, Trudy, I'm married to you because it works, right? I'm with you because it functions. You're with her because you love her. You feel like you empathize with her. It's an emotional attachment you have. And I think this is the problem we have in the West, that we say we would love to have this kind of emotional connection to our civilization and past. But since we can no longer feel it, we have to think it. But I'm not sure if this is enough. I can be wrong about this. And I see, particularly among the younger population, a push towards the feeling and not just the thinking. But among the intellectuals, I think this is a very, very, it's just not going to work. Right? Because let me give you an example why I think it's not going to work. Because you have to be willing then, if you really believe it, to sacrifice for it. So the devout Muslim, whatever you think about Islam, he's making the leap of faith. He's willing to die, to kill, to suffer for his religion. But the quote-unquote new Christian believes in Christianity because it works. It's like becoming... Joining a religion is not the same as joining the, Salisbury's, bonus club. Where it's good for me because I get my sandwich 2 pence cheaper. That's not the same thing. It's a good community also can put demands on me. We're right back to what we said earlier in our conversation. It's the rights, but it's also the obligations. And I think even these new quote-unquote Christians, they want to have all the benefits, but I'm not entirely sure if they're also willing to have all the obligations that come with it.
So you don't think there is deep belief left in European civilization?
Well, I give you my favorite example, and I would never speak ill of anybody, and I don't mean this in a personal matter. But when a couple of years ago, the Pope Francis said, well, Christianity is a way to salvation, but it's not the only way. I say, this is okay if you say this, it's okay if I say this, but if the head of the Catholic Church says that, you know what, that whole Christianity thing is interesting, but it's not really the necessary thing. It's like, I don't know, imagine you join the Manchester United fan club and the president of your fan club says, listen, if Manchester United wins the game, it's really cool, it's really awesome. But to be honest, I think if Liverpool wins, it's also okay. You think I'm in the wrong club, like you're with the wrong people. And this is what I see with Christianity in the West as well. If those who are supposed to be the staunchest believers are saying, not really that important, is it? Well, how can you then expect anybody else to believe in it?
Unless, I mean, we've already discussed the hollowness of our supposed leaders, political leaders, and if the Pope is hollow and is Christian only in terms of the clothes that he wears and the verses empty to him which he is prepared to recite because it's Sunday, that's not to say that the people, a church is its congregation. It's not the minister. It's not the man at the pulpit. He can be there on his own on a Sunday, and he doesn't have a church. The church is the congregation. Otherwise, it's just an empty building with a man in fancy dress standing at the western end of it. You know.
No, I think that's...
And what we're not hearing from, because of the way things are structured and the silencing and the censorship and the way that things have gone and the way in which people have been discouraged, we're not hearing from the people. I maintain faith in the idea that while we've got sock puppet, empty shells who don't believe what they're saying, and that's why belief has fallen away from them, but I believe in the congregation.
No, I think that's true. My hope is, and this is what I keep my fingers crossed, and maybe we'll live to see it, is I mean, I'm still a Catholic. I'm still a part of the church, but I don't go to mass, to be quite honest. Because if I want to hear left-wing political views, I just have to turn on the TV. I don't have to go to church. However, if there will ever be a pope from, let's say, Africa, who is really solid in their faith, this is the day I'm start going back to church. Because here's the thing. I might don't believe in virgin conception. Maybe I don't believe in the miracles. But I sure as, if you forgive me saying this, I sure as hell want the guy on the top of my church to believe in it. That's the thing. If I have doubts, it's okay as a member of the flock. Yes. But the shepherd must believe in it. So the day when somebody returns who says, I honestly believe in this, like this did happen, Jesus did rise from the dead. I said, I might have my doubts, but I don't want the head of my church to have doubts. So when that person returns, I will also start to return to the church. And as you said before, I think you will see, this is also part of this dry tinder we talked about. I think then this kind of flame, if you want, of belief is coming back.
That is the note that I would choose to end this conversation on. Only a gap until the next conversation, though. Ralph Schoellhammer, it's a pleasure always to talk to you. I will earnestly look forward to our next conversation, but for being so generous with your time so far, thank you.
Anytime, Neil. Anytime.